Good morning, everyone. So my name is Hervé Cotin. I would define myself as an astrochemist. I'm a chemist by training, and I'm working. My field of research is more the composition of the small bodies of the solar system, meteorites, and more specifically the comets, the organic content of comets. But I was asked to talk this morning about prebiotic chemistry on Earth and elsewhere. I don't plan to explain you everything about the origin of life, from the much basic organic compounds to the most complex biomolecules. I will more specifically focus on the first stage and what we could consider to be the main important, the most relevant organic ingredients to account for the first steps towards the origin of life. I know that some of you are not chemists, some of you didn't have a chemistry class since a while, so I will try to be as basic as possible, not to get you into the most specific details of the current knowledge in prebiotic chemistry, but my goal is more to tell you what are the most important questions, what are the things that are not obvious today, and what are the things that are sometimes considered as granted and actually are not. So this is what I'm going to tell you about this morning. And sometimes when you read science papers, sometimes, but often when you read the press, it seems that everything is settled. For instance, this is the headlines that was in April 2017. Actually, what was the science discovery? It was the detection of hydrogen in the plumes of Enceladus. So it was detected by mass spectroscopy in the Cassini spacecraft when it was flying through the plumes of the Enceladus moon around Saturn. And hydrogen was detected, and it was an interesting thing. And then the conclusion was, oh, there might be energy inside the planet to support life. And there might be food for aliens, for extraterrestrial. And so maybe there's life in the moon of Enceladus, but probably it's not by detecting hydrogen that you may conclude that there might be life, and there's possibility of life in the ocean of Enceladus. So I'm going to try to tell you that, well, we need to dream a little bit, of course, but in the science field, you need to stick somehow to the fact and what we know about the chemistry of the origin of life. And sometimes you see things like that. So it's on a NASA website describing a space mission called Europa Clipper, and you can read that Europa could have the ingredients needed for life: water, chemistry, and energy. And what do we know about that? Is that enough for life? And it turns, for me, it's not an equation. It doesn't mean that liquid water, organic matter, and energy would result in life. It's more an axiom, and an axiom is a statement that is so evident or well established. It's more well established in its case that it is accepted without controversy or question. And I will try to question that axiom today. Is that granted that we will find life everywhere we have liquid water, organic matter, and energy? And how can we question that? So the outlines of my talks are the first step of chemistry towards the origin of life. Then I will talk about the chemical ingredients in a prebiotic soup. What are the chemical ingredients towards life? What could be the organic recipes towards life? And then we'll go shopping a little bit. It was Black Friday yesterday, and we will go in the places where we can find the interesting organics for the origin of life. And then we will question to which extent prebiotic chemistry, as we consider it on Earth, can be extrapolated to beyond Earth. So, the basics for a prebiotic chemist would be to find a way to build, well, let's not talk about a molecule, let's talk so far about a small robot, so a structure, any kind of structure. Most probably it's based on carbon. And so André Braque, a French chemist, was defining life as based on little robots making copies of themselves and capable of evolution. So you need to account for the formation of a molecule that will be able to replicate itself and then with time change and evolve. So that's the roots, that's what you want to achieve as a chemist. So it's nice looking like that as a cartoon. If you are thinking more about the kind of reacting network you need, it means that you need to have a molecule, let's call it C, that would get into another molecule called I, and this reaction, that's one important step. This reaction should not be equilibrated, so you should not be able to go back. But you need to produce another C. And you need to produce another C going this way, and then you would need to have two C, and then another C, another C, another C. So it's called self-replication. And C is the catalyst of its own replication. And sometimes you would create C prime, and if C prime is more adapted to its environment, the formation of C primes would win over the formation of C, and then you would generate C prime, C prime, and C prime. And it comes with an energy cost. So it means that if you want to avoid going back, it means that when you go from C to I, the energy to get back should be high enough to prevent this reverse reaction. And then you would go to this further stage when you would accumulate C or C prime over time. So that's an important thing to consider when you think about prebiotic chemistry. And well, this is a quite complicated scheme, but the take-home message from this scheme, it was written by John Sutherland, a chemist I will talk a little bit more about later in this talk. So is depicting the time or system complexity of prebiotic compounds here, the degree of aliveness, so it's not straightforward, not living or living, but complexification would tend to getting to something that would be considered as alive. And, well, he considers that the current state of the field in prebiotic chemistry is there. So we're far from having understood everything that would get from the first prebiotic ingredients toward living system, and far, far away from what we could look as our last universal common ancestor. So I will try to take you there. Not far, but at least somewhere we know about. So what do we need to account for? And I will talk about life as we know it on Earth. So what is considered to be necessary for a living being on Earth in terms of chemical ingredients. So, I'm not a biologist, so I will get really to the basics, extremely simplistic view of the biology in my view, but well, first you need a cell, you need a membrane, and inside the cell you can roughly say that the living system is based on proteins, and proteins are built from information that is stored on DNA, and this information is translated into RNA, and it gets into the ribosomes, and ribosomes are a mixture of proteins and RNA. So Roughly speaking, for living system, you need to account for the formation of RNA or DNA and the formation of proteins. So, proteins are way beyond my field of expertise, but to build a protein, you need to make sequence of molecules that are called amino acids. And then the sequence, a small sequence of amino acids is called a peptide. And what is an amino acid? Amino acid could be any kind of organic compound that has an NH2 group and CO2H group. So acid carboxylic and ammonia and amine group, so you make an amino acid. So it turns out that the living system on Earth have selected among the combination, any kind of combination of that kind of compound, so you can change R by anything you would like. So you can imagine a broad range of amino acids, but living systems have selected 20 of these amino acids to build the proteins. DNA and RNA compounds are also wonderful, complex biomolecules, but as a chemist, if you look into the building blocks, it's not that complicated. I mean, in terms of ingredients. What do you need here? You need, so this is the structure of DNA, you need those molecules in blue. The blue molecules are the sugars, so in DNA it's desoxyribose, in RNA it's ribose. You need to link those sugars by phosphate, PO4, and then you need to link on the ribose or desoxyribose a molecule called a nucleobase. So there are 4 in DNA, 4 in RNA. In total, there are 5 compounds because you have adenine, cytosine, guanine, thymine, and thymine is replaced by uracil in RNA. So you could think, basically, that if you can account for the formation of the sugars, the nucleobases, and the phosphate, well, then you would figure out a way to link them together, and then you will get to DNA and RNA easily. So, to build the first prebiotic robot, the first prebiotic system able to replicate, to evolve, based on what we know from life on Earth, you would need to account in prebiotic conditions, which means you need to imagine and demonstrate that those syntheses are possible without a chemist, without someone adding the ingredients at the right time, in the right environment, at the right temperature. You need to account for the formation of those compounds easily in an environment that is relevant to what we think of the primitive Earth. So, without all the biochemical support that are present today in living systems. So you need to account the formation of the membrane. So membranes are thought to originate from long amphiphylled chains, so long organic chains with one end of the chain which likes to be in water, the other end of the chain which doesn't like to be in water, so it would self-organize to create a membrane. You would need to account the formation of the amino acids, the starting material to get to proteins. You need to account for the phosphate, nucleobases, and sugars to imagine how to produce DNA and RNA. So, how do you do that? So, one historical idea was brought by Alexander Oparin, and he wrote in one of his first book in the 1920s this idea, this simple idea. At first we found carbon scattered in the form of separate atoms in the red hot stellar atmosphere, so it's nucleosynthesis, carbon starts there. We then found it as a component of hydrocarbons which appears at the surface of the Earth. So the carbons will turn into organic compounds. In the water of primitive oceans, these substances form more complex compounds, and then chemistry in liquid water starts, there was evolution, and protein and similar substance appeared. They acquired a more and more complex and improved structure and were finally transformed into primary living beings, the forebears of life on Earth. So the idea here proposed by Oparin is that you take the ingredients, you put them in liquid water, and then you wait. The law of chemistry in the environments of the primitive Earth would naturally turn those organic compounds into, let's say it like that, biomolecules, and then you would have life. So you just let the chemistry, the law of physics and chemistry play, and life would appear. So, as more synthetic way, you have the bricks, amino acids, sugars, nucleobases, phosphates, and you need to imagine how it can't build a living system by itself. So I didn't build it, but someone did. Well, here in prebiotic chemistry, no one did. So, but chemical ingredients are not Lego bricks. There are laws, there are affinities, there are reactions that will make some molecules more susceptible to react with another in a specific environment. But this is the kind of challenge we are facing. So, what are the most basic prebiotic recipes that we know about? So, I'm not going into too much details of organic synthesis, but just to give you ideas of what is, roughly easy to say it like that, what is known for a long time, and what is more complex, and what are the current difficulties in the field of prebiotic chemistry. So, if you want an amino acid, you could think, it's extraordinary, it's a basic ingredient of living system, of protein. Once you have amino acids, you have proteins, and you have life. Well, no. Amino acids are quite easy molecules to achieve. And actually, it's known since 1850 by a chemist called Strecker, a German chemist. So he wasn't studying the origin of life, but he was trying to synthesize amino acids. And he demonstrated that from an aldehyde, ammonia, and hydrogen cyanide in liquid water, in 3 steps, you reach an amino acid. So first you have the addition of the ammonia on the aldehyde, and you produce an imine. And then the imine would react with HCN, and you will get an alpha-aminonitrile. And then you need liquid water to turn the CN function into a CO2H function, and then you have the amino acids. I remind you that R could be anything, anything else. So it's not complicated. Well, you need at least to have those ingredients, but to produce amino acids is not brand new, top-notch chemistry. It's known from a long time. If now you consider the nucleobases, I won't go into all the 5 nucleobases, but this is an example I like. It's for the formation of adenine. So adenine is the A letter of the genetic code. This is this molecule, but you can account for the production of adenine simply by condensation of HCN, hydrogen cyanide. So you need 1, 2, 3, 4, some photolysis for rearrangement, and a 5th HCN, and then you get adenine. And it's known since the 60s. And there are various ways, chemical pathways, to get to the other cytosine, guanine, thymine, uracils. Well, the yields are not extraordinary, but at least we have ideas to produce those kind of compounds in prebiotic conditions. And if you turn to sugars, so sugars are both simple or complicated, but if you only take formaldehyde and you put it in liquid water with some suitable catalysis like calcium carbonate, clay minerals, or calcium hydroxide, you would induce a polymerization of formaldehyde, and then you will get pentose and hexose sugars, a large variety of sugars. It's really easy to get to sugars from formaldehyde. The thing is that here you see a chromatogram after that kind of reaction, the Butlerov-Formose reaction. You have a mixture, such a complex mixture of sugars. Each peak here is a sugar that, well, if you look for ribose, it's only one small peak in this large diversity, and then the question would be, how life did select ribose? If life started with RNA and ribose, how did life start selected ribose, since it's only a minor product in this large variety? But producing sugars are not complex also. What is complicated is the next step. To say things only with one example, if you want to link amino acids to produce peptide, you have the amino acids, it's easy, but then if you want to link amino acid to make a peptide bond, this is this reaction, so alanine and amino acid and glycine. If you want to link them, you will have this equilibrium and it will produce water. Well, even if you didn't make a lot of chemistry, you probably remember that if you have an equilibrium, if you have a lot of one of the ingredients on one side of the equilibrium or on the other, it will tend to move the equilibrium in the other directions. And if you try to make this reaction of simply linking two amino acids in liquid water, thermodynamics would tell you that the equilibrium would be shifted to the left because you are in liquid water. So this reaction is not going naturally into linking amino acid. It would go naturally into hydrolysis of amino acid into this direction. So once you have the amino acids, you don't have proteins. It's far more complicated. And if you consider what we call nucleoside or nucleotide. A nucleoside is linking the nucleobase to the ribose, and nucleotide would be linking the phosphate, the ribose, and the nucleobase. You can achieve that. People manage to do that, but most of the time it's achieved in the solid state at high temperature, and the yield for formation is extremely low, and you would add the ribose to adenine here, not necessarily at the right position. So that's not obvious, that's far from being straightforward, and the same if you want to add the phosphate here. So the most critical questions in prebiotic chemistry is not to make the initial ingredients. I will tell you, we observe them. We know it was available on the primitive Earth to some extent, but the next steps are the most tricky, and those that are really questions right now in prebiotic chemistry. And well, I could say that for maybe 40 years, since all the reactions I showed you are from the 19th centuries or the 1960s, so people know about those ingredients since a while ago. And roughly for 30 to 40 years, the prebiotic chemistry was not really progressing, because the idea was to build the molecules like Legos, going from amino acids to proteins, going to nucleobases and sugars and phosphates to RNA and DNA. And in 2009, John Sutherland and his team made some kind of breakthrough, because, well, they were considering the classical chemical approach, which is shown here. So here you produce a precursor of ribose here. Here you produce cytosine, and we know how to get there. We know how to get there, but we don't know how to link them to make the nucleotide here. And for 40 years, the chemists were trying to go from brick to brick and assemble them. Well, it was making sense, but nobody achieved something really significant. And John Sutherland and his team decided to apply the chemical approach called system chemistry. And basically the idea is simple, but nobody thought about it before. It's to mix all the initial ingredients, not to start from the precursor of ribose and cytosine and then mixing them together, but mixing all the ingredients and bypassing this step that nobody was trying to achieve, and going directly to the nucleotide. Well, it doesn't mean we understood the origin of life, but at least a significant progress was achieved. And I said I will keep it simple for chemistry, but in 2015 the same team from John Sutherland proposed still using the basic concept of system chemistry with the same ingredients, some catalysis here based on copper, some photolysis at some steps, but with the same basic ingredients, they can make precursors of RNA, protein, and lipid in a single pot. Still, it's not life, but in the recent few years, there have been a lot of change in the chemistry, in the prebiotic chemistry, and well, it will be in my conclusion. We can start to be optimistic. At least the field is now progressing rapidly because the approach has changed. Maybe it doesn't give anything in 10 years or 20 years. We would need another breakthrough, but well, now things are progressing, and we can be very happy about that. But we still need the ingredients. And so let's go find them, and let's try to find the best place, most suitable place to find them. So I will talk about 3 classical approaches that I don't want you to think I mean they are in competition. They could perfectly work together, but just for the sake of clarity, I will divide into three domains. What can be formed in the atmosphere of a planet, first the Earth or other planets, what can be formed in the oceans, and what can be brought by meteorites and comets. So this is the atmosphere of the Earth, you can see here. And here is the atmosphere of Titan, the largest moon of Saturn, where a lot of chemistry, organic chemistry, occurs. So the root of the idea that the atmosphere could have played an important role in the prebiotic chemistry and origin of life goes back to 1953, where Stanley Miller published his paper saying that when you try to simulate the kind of chemistry that could naturally occur in the primitive Earth, choosing an atmosphere made of methane, ammonia, water vapor, and hydrogen. There are a lot of other possibilities, but with Stanley Miller, for good reason at that time, chose this combination. He showed that a lot of interesting chemistry occurred. No, I should start here. So, how do you simulate the prebiotic chemistry on Earth? So you have 2 reservoirs. One here is the atmosphere. So you mix methane, ammonia, water, hydrogen, and if you mix those gases, nothing would happen. Well, here it's filled with those compounds. You can keep it like that for days, weeks, months, years, nothing would happen. Unless you bring energy. And energy could be the UVs, photons from the sun. At that time, it was not easy to have a good UV lamp in the lab, so they chose to bring energy by spark discharge, simulating storms in the primitive atmosphere. And what happens? This is what's happening. Once you launch the experiments, within a few hours, there's some kind of messy stuff, that brown stuff that would cover the whole experiment. It's produced in the gaseous phase, and then you see it goes down to, well, the primitive ocean, liquid water that is heated, because we think that primitive ocean were warmer than now, and also for chemistry, if you want to go faster, you warm your experimental setup to make chemistry go faster. And it's really been a breakthrough at that time, because Stanley Miller showed that some amino acids, at that time 4 were detected, now much more have been detected, but 4 amino acids were detected at that time. And it's been really a breakthrough. At that time, people were thinking, oh, we have the amino acids, we will get to the proteins. The importance of DNA and RNA were not known at that time, so life was basically proteins. So it was thought that, well, the mystery of the origin of life was solved simply by forming amino acids. But what is important to remember is that it's not only amino acids, it's a lot of chemical organic ingredients that are formed. Some are soluble, like the amino acids, and some are not soluble. There is all these brown stuffs that I will talk into more details later that is also formed. And there have been experiments that have been reproduced since the time of Stanley Miller, by Stanley Miller himself, with new techniques, and it shows that it's not only amino acids, there are thousands and thousands of organic compounds that are produced during those experiments. But, there's a but, the efficiency of those experiments clearly depends on the choice of the gas mixture you have in the beginning. In the 1950s, it was the most accepted idea that the Earth atmosphere, the primitive Earth atmosphere, would have been reduced. Now, well, let's say it's disputed. We don't know. We'll hear a little bit more certainly this afternoon about that. But, well, it depends on models. And if you have that kind of mixture, it's good for the production of organics. If you start with an initial atmosphere with CO2 and N2, you produced almost nothing. At least it's not as good, because you can get to produce amino acids with a good yield if you start to control a little bit your environment. It means that you need to have the water in your experimental setup for which the pH is buffered. You need to add antioxidant to your starting experimental setup, and if you start to control the initial mixture, then you can get good yields of production of amino acids. But, well, you need more, you have less degrees of liberties, to say it like that. So maybe it occurred like that, but it's model dependent. So you cannot exclude a large production of organic matter in the Earth atmosphere because you don't know exactly what were the initial ingredients, but it's model dependent. But elsewhere, for instance, in the atmosphere of Titan, this time it's observed, it's not model dependent. We know that the atmosphere of Titan is made of nitrogen with a few percent of methane. And we can observe that the surface of Titan is hidden, at least in the visible wavelength. You can see the surface of Titan because you made a kind of Miller experiment at the scale of the moon, and you produce a lot of organic compounds, organic aerosols. Some people would call them tholins, and those tholins would sediment slowly and fall at the surface. And it's because the atmosphere has a good composition that is favorable for organic synthesis. So it means that there are a lot of interesting stuff that can occur in atmospheres, but it needs to have the right composition, and this composition for the primitive Earth is not known, and it might have been efficient for organic synthesis or not. We cannot really know for sure. Another interesting environment is to go at the bottom of the ocean in environments called hydrothermal vents. And in those hydrothermal vents, you have the water that would circulate through the crust. It would be heated and it would interact with a lot of materials, minerals. There would be reactions that would turn compounds like CO2 or N2 into CH4 or NH3. So it would turn, it would make the ingredients, the organic ingredients, more reduced. And there have been experiments in the laboratory showing that if you simulate, if you try to do a Miller-like experiment for the hydrothermal vents, if you try to simulate those kind of environments, you would detect a lot of organic on this view graph. You would see the detection of amino acids. I could show other compounds, but I stick to amino acids because it's easy to understand and to keep my message clear. But you can imagine that at the bottom of the ocean you can have those kind of syntheses. And it has been argued that the strong temperature gradient between the hydrothermal vents and the water in the surrounding would be good for polymerization of organics. What would be not good is that you reach extremely high temperature and you could discute the stability of the chemical ingredients that you find interesting in those environments. There have been ideas also that the life could, not the ingredient, but the life itself could appear in those hydrothermal vents. And this is hot water circulating in this and in little cells, compartments, but not with a membrane, with an organic membrane. But the compartment would be minerals, and there would be organic chemistry occurring in those minerals, and then you would have the proteins, DNA, RNA formed in those mineral compartments, and then the membrane would form, and then the cells would get out from those hydrothermal vents. So it's an interesting idea, but you will see later that maybe there is a problem with the kind of energy that is available in those environments. But that's on this basis, on this kind of idea that the fact that when we think about Enceladus, Europa, hydrothermal vents on those moons, that there could be life on those moons is mainly based on this kind of idea for the origin of life. The third way to get organics is to look into space and to see what comes from space naturally. And what comes from space naturally are meteorites, roughly today 10 tons a year. It's not much, but also micrometeorites, and micrometeorites are much higher flux, roughly 10,000 tons a year right now. So, what is good with comets, meteorites? So, I don't say it because I'm working in this field. I try to be well. I don't try to be biased. What is good is that it's not model dependent. At least the composition is not model dependent, because the composition of meteorites falling on Earth right now that we can analyze, the composition of comets that we can analyze right now, well, as far as we understand the process of the formation of the solar system, the dynamics of those objects, their composition right now is the same than it was 4 billion years, 4.5 billion years ago. What is model dependent, maybe, would be the flux, the amount of those compounds. Either there's been a late heavy bombardment or not, either there's been a late Venir event. Well, we cannot know for sure how much, but at least we know what is there. So these are pictures of two of the most famous carbonaceous meteorite. We call them carbonaceous chondrite. This is the Murchison meteorite. This is the Orgueil meteorite. And Murchison meteorite is one of the most famous meteorite in the field. There are a lot of carbonaceous chondrites that have been studied, but a lot of studies have been focused on the Murchison meteorites because more than 75 amino acids have been detected. So I said that life was using 20 amino acids, but you can imagine a lot of other amino acids. And more than 75 amino acids, and 8 of them are amino acids that are used for life. There are much more than amino acids. Here you see a pie chart showing the kind of organics that are observed in the soluble fraction that is extracted from the carbonaceous chondrite. So you see that there are amino acids. They are not the most dominant compounds. The most dominant compounds are carboxylic acid. You have to pay attention to the fact that when you do that kind of extraction procedure to analyze the composition of organic compounds that are present in carbonaceous chondrite, there is some chemistry. You make some, for instance, some hydrolysis, acid hydrolysis of your material to extract the compound, and you can observe that whether you do an acid hydrolysis or not, the amount of amino acid is not the same. But at least you have the precursors of amino acid and some amino acids that are really inside those meteorites. And recently there has been a dedicated study with some of the most sensitive instruments for organic compounds detection, high resolution mass spectroscopy, and they revealed that they detected tens of thousands of different molecular compositions. So, and it's only masses that are observed because it's mass spectroscopy, so you don't know exactly what is the molecular structure, but at least more than 10 of thousands and likely millions of diverse structures. So it's not necessarily much in abundance, but it's really extremely diversified in terms of the nature of the compounds that are observed. And if you consider the bulk material of a carbonaceous chondrite, we call them carbonaceous chondrite, but well, sometimes it's only 1% of carbon, and well, you can get to 5% of organic compounds. And this organic compound is divided into the soluble organic material, which is 10 to 25% of the organic content of the carbonaceous chondrites. So this is what I've just talked about. But the large majority of the organic component of the chondrites is what we call insoluble organic matter. And insoluble organic matter is something that by definition is not soluble, and it's extremely difficult to exactly know what it is. And there have been attempts to characterize this for decades. And well, this is one representation of what it could look like. It's not a molecule to which you can put a name, you cannot put a formula with a beginning, with an end. It's a large, complex organic structure like this, and it's most of the material that falls on Earth from carbonaceous chondrite. So this is what is available. This is what comes to Earth. Another interesting fact is that part of this insoluble organic matter, if you put it in liquid water, it's insoluble, but part of it would spontaneously form vesicles. So it doesn't mean that you have your membrane like we know it right now, but at least if you put this insoluble organic matter in water spontaneously, you would create some membranes, and you can you can speculate about its the role it might have played in the first living system. So I said a lot about meteorites, but in terms of flux, it's more micrometeorites that are falling on Earth, and some of them are called ultra-carbonaceous Antarctic micrometeorites. And then on those micrometeorites, more than 50% of the content of the micrometeorite is carbon. So it's another kind of material compared to what we find in carbonaceous chondrite. It's really dominated by carbon, a huge amount of carbon, and also a high content of nitrogen compared to what we find in carbonaceous chondrite. And we also have comets. So comets, we know for a long time that in the atmosphere of the comet, we can detect from Earth by spectroscopy that there are a lot of compounds. And if you look, you have formaldehyde, let me find it there, you have ammonia, you have HCN, so you have everything you need to make the Strecker synthesis for amino acids. It's there in the comet. But that's what we detect in the atmosphere. It's not necessarily what is really inside the nucleus. So we've been lucky recently because thanks to the European Rosetta mission, we've been at a comet. Oh, I realized it was since 2014. Well, I hope we had such a long mission, but it was only 2 years at the comet, and we had the possibility to really observe the comet, its behavior, and we start to know a little bit more about its composition, not only what is in the atmosphere, but also what is in the nucleus. There have been spectacular detection by a mass spectrometer called ROSINA, probing the atmosphere, and here they call it a zoo because there are so many molecules that it's like being in a zoo because there are all kinds of varieties of molecules you can imagine. It's there. What is shown here in bold are new detections compared to previous detection in cometary environment. So it brought a lot of diversity. Actually, the ESA made this infography because well, for the chemist, it doesn't make sense to spread molecules as smelly compounds, poisonous compounds, big compounds. But well, it's fun, and you can note that there is a king of the zoo, and the king of the zoo is glycine. Why? Because it's easy when you detect glycine to make some outreach about the origin of life, because glycine is an amino acid and it's kind of an iconic compound, and everybody jump glycine, life. Wow. question solved. But well, this is a detection of glycine. So it's been detected by mass spectroscopy. So you detect the mass. So this is the mass of glycine, but you can have several composition structures that have the same masses, and then looking into more details and the fragmentation patterns, you can assume with a good assurance that it's glycine that has been detected in the atmosphere of the comet. So it's been detected, but it's not complicated. As I said earlier, Strecker synthesis requires liquid water. We don't know if there has been liquid water on comets, but you don't need liquid water to make glycine. This is another way to get to glycine. Here you start from methylammonium and CO2 in ice. You warm a little bit the ice. You put some photons, UV photons, and you will get methylammonium methylglycinate, which is once a salt of glycine. Here, this is glycine. You add a H plus here, and you have glycine. So it's not, well, it doesn't require a lot of complex, elaborated prebiotic chemistry in cometary ice to get to glycine. So it would have been surprising not to detect glycine, to say the least. What else? What could be present in the solid phase of comets? As you know, Philae had some troubles to add a nominal operation sequence because it bounced and it could not really analyze the solid phase. But on board Rosetta, for 2 years, we collected dust particles that were emitted from the nucleus. And I was part of the team of the COSIMA instrument, which was catching dust particles. And here you see 2 dust particles, one called Kinef and the other called Juliette. And those 2 dust particles were the first on which we've been really able to detect its organic component. Here you can see the abundance of carbon. This is arbitrary units. I will take into the actual abundance later, but you can see that when you scan the composition of the particle, you see we are next to the particle, so there's no carbon detected, and when you start to rise on the particle, analyze the particle itself, here and here, you see that the carbon content is detected. And we've been able to demonstrate that the signature, the mass spectral signature of this carbonaceous material that is detected in the dust particles are consistent with what we obtain when we analyze on the ground instrument insoluble organic matter. The best match we have in our library of organic compounds to fit our observation at the comet. We can only match. We don't bring the samples back on Earth. But the best match we have is insoluble organic matter, the same kind as observed in meteorites. So that kind of complex molecular organic structure. How much of it? So this is a paper that will be published in the next few days. We've been able to measure the abundance of the elements, and what we see. So this is the bulk composition of the dust particles. So it's not only 2. We've been able to measure it on more than 20 particles, and we have more data. We are still processing, but roughly, we have in atom number 1/3 of carbon, 1/3 of oxygen, 1/3 of hydrogen, and small amount of silicon, iron, and other elements. So in atom mass, since oxygen is heavier, you have a little bit more of oxygen. And then if you spread the elements by educated guesses between the mineral phase and the organic phase, you came to the conclusion that in mass, roughly 45% of the composition of the dust particle is made of this high molecular weight organic component, which has similarities to insoluble organic matter. And if you want to make some budget of carbon in the comet, here it's much more assumption. Actually, I wrote in prep because it's in prep because I still lack data to finish that, because what we miss really at this stage, it's really the ratio of volatile, the gas, to solid in the nucleus. So people are arguing in the Rosetta community about this ratio. Some people claim it's 5, so it's published, so I use this number to make this projection. But if it's really 5, so much more solid than volatile, than ice in the cometary dust, then you would have some of the carbon that is stored in CO and CO2 ice in the nucleus. You have a large diversity of organic compounds, the Rosina zoo, but it would be only in this scenario 2% of the amount. But it doesn't mean it's it's negligible, but it's only 2% of the amount, and roughly 88% of the carbon in the comet would be in this form of macromolecular material. So it's roughly the same that what we observed in the carbonaceous chondrite. The carbon is really in the form of this macromolecular material. In the comet, you have much more carbon than in the carbonaceous chondrite. But the repartition between the volatile soluble phase and the macromolecular insoluble phase is roughly the same. Just quickly, because how do you get those compounds? Sun Kwok talked a little bit about interstellar chemistry. Just a few words about what could be the equivalent of the Miller experiment of interstellar or cometary ices, but you can reproduce it in the laboratory. You can condense a gas mixture. Here it's made of methane, H2O, ammonia and CO on a cold plate. And then you put energy. It can be radiation, it can be UV photons, or it can be simply warming up the sample. And after adding energy, most of the time you get on your substrate, on your cold plate, when it's back at room temperature, you observed a residue called yellow stuff. And in this residue, you have a part of insoluble matter, part of soluble matter. It depends on the UV dose or radiation dose that reach the ice. And well, this is some kind of inventory, partial inventory, I should say, of the molecules that are detected after that kind of experimentation. So it's easy to achieve a complex mixture of organics, but does it necessarily mean because it's complex mixture that it's easier to get life afterwards? It's not straightforward. So we're done with the shopping. You can have contribution of the atmosphere. It's model dependent. It could have played a leading role on the primitive Earth, or minor, we don't know. There could have been a contribution of hydrothermal vents. They are good at producing, they are good at destroying. Well, it's not easy really to simulate those environments, so there's clearly a lack of experimental data. And there are exogenous deliveries of organics. It's an ongoing process. We have really concrete, solid observations, but as I said earlier, we don't really know how much fall on the primitive Earth. But, well, they are not in competition. Sometimes chemists say too many cooks can spoil the prebiotic soup. We don't care. At least we know we've had organics on the primitive Earth. So, what about beyond Earth? if we look about the targets, what we are really considering as interesting for the search of life beyond Earth and the search of prebiotic chemistry beyond Earth, there are three kinds of targets. Of course, there's Mars. I won't talk a little bit about. I won't talk about Mars this morning. I don't have time for that. But you could think that, well, what if life appeared on Mars? It probably followed the same kind of evolution process, prebiotic chemistry processes, than it occurred on Earth. It was the two planets had a lot of similarities, differences too, but the two planets had similarities, and what worked on Earth could have worked on Mars and vice versa. You have another family which is somehow different, the icy moons, because here you're not at the surface, you are at the bottom of the oceans. You have to neglect the contribution of the atmosphere because you don't have an atmosphere. If you consider importation of organic material from comets, meteorites, well, they fall at the surface. There is no atmosphere to break down, so they fall at the surface at high velocity, so a lot would be probably destroyed, and then you need to imagine some scenario to get those organic material to go down at the bottom of the ice sheet in the liquid oceans. You can imagine that, but it's probably something quite different than what occurred on Earth. And for those icy moons, well, then you can imagine, if you have hydrothermal vents, that something could occur there. And you have the exoplanets. But, well, we don't know enough yet about exoplanets to start really considering elaborated thinking about prebiotic chemistry. It will come necessarily, but so this is why I will focus only on moons like Europa and Enceladus. Why those moons? Because if you look at Ganymede and Callisto, the liquid ocean would be into two ice layers. And on Europa and Enceladus, you really have the liquid water in contact with the rocky core of the planet. So, are we crazy about liquid water? Because we say if there is liquid water, sometimes there might be life. Well, liquid water is interesting because first, the water molecule is the second most abundant in the universe after H2. So there's a lot of water in the universe, not necessarily in the liquid phase, but there's a lot of water. Water has some physicochemical properties that are not found in other solvents, at least not together. You can have solvents which have some properties, other solvent other properties. In water, you have you have some properties that are mixed together, and it's called a molecular matchmaker. It's really good to make a lot of reactions that could not be achieved in other solvents. Well, but we have to keep in mind that so far liquid water is not observed. Well, we're pretty sure there's liquid water below the icy surfaces of Enceladus or Europa, but we have not seen it. We're pretty sure that there have been liquid water at the surface of Mars, but well, we haven't seen it. Maybe some temporary spread of liquid water, but it's not straightforward. And of course, nobody ever proved that if you have liquid water, there's necessarily life. And as I said, well, liquid water might be the best and the worst for the origin of life. Because if you are only in liquid water, maybe you won't be able to achieve some critical steps for polymerization, for instance, of interesting molecules. So you found scenarios for the complexification and replication of matter that requires a dry phase. This is a scenario proposed by Comeras in the late 19th, early 2000s. And here it's for the polymerization of amino acids to create peptides. It's a cycle where you need at least one sequence would be dry, and the other sequence would be in the aqueous phase. And this is a recent paper published this summer. Origin of the RNA world, the fate of nucleobases in warm little ponds. And this is another scenario that considers also that to polymerize nucleotide, you need to have a sequence dry and a sequence that would be wet. So you cannot imagine that kind of chemistry inside an ocean. You would need to be at the surface, and you would here they talk about evaporation, but yesterday Hervé Martin was talking about the tides at the surface of the primitive continents. Well, you need to get to aqueous phase, to dry phase, to condense. So that's something to keep in mind. Maybe you can polymerize purely in liquid water, but that's not really the state of the art of the current thinking in prebiotic chemistry. Are we really missing something if we consider only carbon? There are a lot of questions about life based on silicon, other elements. Well, I don't have time to discuss that in details, but carbon is rather abundant in the universe. We observe, we just heard about it, that there is spontaneous organic chemistry occurring in the interstellar medium, in other astrophysical environment. It's not because it's complex organic that it's necessarily good for life, because insoluble organic matter is not necessarily a good precursor for life. At least we don't know. We need to assess that. But, well, I like to show that because there's really now in the mind of people, organic chemistry is really linked to life. And here you look at the books of organic chemistry, the textbooks at universities. There's always, here there's a tree, or at least there's a molecule, but on this one it's a butterfly and a flower. And it's organic chemistry, and there's something, and outside the scientific community, organic chemistry is clearly linked to life. And I really like this cover. It's pure organic chemistry, and well, that's the chemistry of carbon, not the chemistry of life. Organic chemistry is the chemistry of carbon. And when you look at the source of carbon, as I said, most of it is the form of complex organic matter. And if I go back to things I said earlier, if you look at this complex, messy stuff that is formed in majority in the Miller-Urey experiments, it's that kind of insoluble matter, and this is formed in majority. What we call the yellow stuff formed by ice irradiation, depending on the dose, but if you have high dose of radiation, the majority of the sample would be insoluble complex organic matter. And here, this is Stanley Miller, this is Mayo Greenberg, who worked a lot on this kind of experiment. This is Clifford Matthews, who is working on HCN polymers. So if you simply have HCN and let it polymerize, you would get within a few hours, a few days, a complex dark mixture that is extremely complicated to assess. So we think about prebiotic chemistry as a linear process. So prebiotic compounds, starting of the biomolecules, life, this way. But as I showed John Sutherland shows that it's not necessarily that linear, and if you think about most of the organic components that is synthesized, it's in the form of those macromolecular material, and maybe we need to think about if you have this macromolecular in liquid water, if if it has some relevance in prebiotic chemistry, and so far it's not been really studied, because it's really the majority of carbon in the solar system in this form. I showed you the synthesis of adenine following this complexification, linear complexification. This is another way to get adenine. From HCN polymer, you condense the HCN polymer, and in liquid water, you would get, after hydrolysis, you would get adenine from HCN polymer. So it's not necessarily from simple to complex. You can get simple, extremely complex, and then you simplify to get some key elements. Okay, I skip this one. And so maybe the prebiotic soap was a soap of macromolecule. At least there were some macromolecule in the prebiotic soap. What about energy? It's my last sequence. 5 minutes. It's okay.
Okay. No more.
No more. Promise. Is any kind of energy okay? Because we say you need liquid water, you need organic compounds, you need energy. But is any kind of energy okay? And is the energy needed now for life, to sustain life, is it the same kind of energy you needed to start the process of life? And nowadays, the icy moons with oceans start to become the new El Dorado for the solar system exploration, the astrobiological solar system exploration. I don't want you to think, I think we don't need to explore those worlds. But it's more complex and not straightforward as it appeared when you read some papers or and when you read the communication of the space agencies. Because on those moons, on Enceladus, you have liquid water, you have organic compounds because they have been detected in the plumes that are ejected from the surface of Enceladus, and you have energy because if you have the hydrogen that is detected, as I said earlier, it's probably connected to some hydrothermal activity at the bottom of the ocean. But I want to go back to this scheme I showed you. Robert Pascal, John Sutherland, Adi Pross have been thinking about that kind of system, and as I said, you really don't want to go back here. You want to have this cycling, and you don't want it to be a reversible reaction, to accumulate the chemical you find interesting. And it comes with an energy cost. And André Pascal estimated that, at least in liquid water, this energy cost is roughly in the range of visible light and UV light. So if you consider thermal energy, redox energy that could be provided at the bottom of the ocean, you probably, at least you're not meeting the requirements of that kind of chemistry that is currently considered for prebiotic chemistry on Earth. So we don't know, maybe you can produce life in different ways, but right now the necessity of UV light, energy in form of UV or visible light, seems to be a requirement, at least for life as we know it. So ingredients for life: water, chemistry, energy. And here, this is the last paper of John Sutherland in Nature Reviews a few months ago. And he writes, a requirement for ultraviolet irradiation to generate hydrated electrons would rule out deep sea environment. This, along with strong bioenergetic and structural arguments, suggests that the idea that life originated at vents should, like the vents themselves, remain in the deep bottom of the ocean. So such statements don't please a lot of people, but at least it's consistent in the way of thinking of John Sutherland. So, and it's not the worst chemist, the prebiotic chemist nowadays. So, still quoting John Sutherland, in the same paper, and we have to be optimistic, but he said we are not yet close to achieve the understanding of prebiotic chemistry, but recent results suggest that we may have already finished the first phase, the beginning. So we are achieve the beginning of the prebiotic chemistry, and if you remember my scheme at the beginning of my lecture, the arrow was really at the beginning. But we can be optimistic that in the years to come, maybe a few years or a few decades, I don't know, but major breakthrough can be achieved in the inorganic prebiotic chemistry. Probably, if we want to say we have understood prebiotic chemistry, well, we necessarily need to find another form of life, because based only on life on Earth, one example, it's a little bit limited for really understanding prebiotic chemistry, or maybe if we success in the laboratory, to synthesize a living form. Well, what would it mean? It's a lot of food for thought. And a last word, we have to keep our feet on the ground, even in the ocean of Enceladus and Europa. And as I said, it doesn't mean we don't need to go there. Actually, we need to go there because there are a lot of things to discover, maybe not for prebiotic chemistry, maybe for prebiotic chemistry, but it's really a different environment, and if life appeared in those oceans, it's probably on a basis that is quite different than what we have on Earth, and then it means that the instruments for space exploration need to take this into account. Thank you.